Come with me. His voice was deep, calm, but carried the weight of something final. Standing at the wooden doorway of the small farmhouse, Grace felt her breath hitch. The man before her looked like sin dressed in wealth, dark hat pulled low, coat dusted from the road, eyes the color of storm clouds. Everyone in town knew who he was. Cole Maddox, the richest rancher in 3 counties. The kind of man who could buy silence with a glance. Grace's father had whispered his name once, right before the sickness took him. He had borrowed money, more than he should have. Enough to keep the farm running through one more harvest. Enough to leave his daughter behind with a promise she didn't understand. And now, that promise had come knocking. Cole's gloved hand rested on the doorframe. Your father owed me $30,000, he said, voice low but clear. I gave him time. That time's up. Grace tried to speak, but her throat closed around the words. She had no money, no livestock left worth selling. Just a patch of land barely holding its green, and a heart that hadn't stopped breaking since the day her father was buried on the hill behind the barn. I don't have anything, she whispered, voice trembling. Nothing you'd want. Cole's eyes lingered on her face longer than they should have, on the stubbornness in her chin, the sorrow in her gaze. That's where you're wrong. He turned away from the door, toward the waiting black stallion tied to the fence. Come with me, he said without looking back. You'll work off your father's debt on my ranch. Food, roof, wages toward what's owed. When it's done, you can go. Grace's heart pounded. Go with him. The town would talk. They already whispered about her, the lonely girl with too much pride and not enough sense. But the alternative was worse, losing everything her father had built. She glanced around the small farmhouse, the cracked teacup on the table, the worn Bible by the bed. Everything she loved was tied to this place. Yet something in the way Cole said her name made her legs move before her mind caught up. Hours later, the countryside blurred past as the wagon rumbled toward Maddox Ranch. The land stretched endlessly, golden fields under a bruised sky. Grace sat stiffly beside him, her hands clasped in her lap. He hadn't spoken since they left. Finally, she found her voice. You take pleasure in this? She asked. Dragging someone's daughter away to pay her father's debt. He turned his head slowly, eyes unreadable. I don't take pleasure in debts, Miss Carter. But I do believe in keeping promises. Your father asked me to make sure you were taken care of if anything happened to him. Grace blinked. What? Cole's jaw tightened. He came to me the day before he got sick. Said he was worried about you. Asked me to keep you safe, whatever it took. The air between them shifted. Grace's anger faltered, replaced by confusion and a strange warmth spreading in her chest. Safe. This doesn't feel safe. He looked at her, and for a moment, the hardness in his eyes softened. You'll understand in time. At Maddox Ranch, the world seemed larger. The house stood tall and white against the horizon, with stables stretching farther than Grace could count. Men worked silently, tipping their hats as they passed. Everyone knew who Cole Maddox was. But no one knew who she was, the girl he brought home in the middle of the night. For days, Grace worked harder than she ever had. Cleaning stalls, feeding horses, cooking for the ranch hands. Cole barely spoke to her except for short, measured instructions. Yet she felt his presence everywhere, in the way he'd pause at the door to check on her, in the quiet coffee left waiting on the table each morning. One evening, a storm rolled across the plains, fierce and wild. Lightning split the sky as rain battered the ranch house. Grace ran outside to pull the horses in from the field, her dress soaked, hair clinging to her face. Cole found her struggling with a frightened mare, her hands trembling. Without a word, he took the reins from her, steady and sure. You're going to get yourself killed out here, he muttered, voice rougher than usual. I couldn't just leave her. She shot back. She was scared. He stepped closer, so close she could feel his breath. So were you. For a long moment, neither moved. The thunder roared, but the world between them went silent. Cole reached up and brushed a strand of wet hair from her cheek. You're not like anyone I've ever met, he said quietly. And you're not the monster I thought you were, she whispered. After that night, something changed. He started teaching her how to ride properly, how to handle cattle, how to see the land not as burden but as promise. And she noticed the way he watched her, not with possession, but with something gentler, something he couldn't hide even when he tried. But Grace also began to hear whispers among the ranch hands. Some said Cole had lost someone years ago, a fiancé who left when his ambition grew too cold. Since then, he'd built walls around his heart, and the only thing he trusted was the land. One afternoon, she found him alone in the barn, fixing a saddle. His hands were steady, but his eyes were distant. "Do you ever get tired of pretending you don't feel anything?" she asked softly. He looked up sharply. "What makes you think I'm pretending?" "Because I see it," she said. "In the way you look at me. In the way you try not to." He stood, closing the distance between them. "You don't understand, Grace. I made a promise to your father. That's why you're here. Not because." "Not because what?" she challenged. He exhaled, eyes flickering with conflict. "Because if I told you the truth, you'd never forgive me." Before she could ask, he walked past her, leaving the scent of rain and leather in his wake. That night, she couldn't sleep. His words replayed in her head like a song with no ending. What truth was he hiding? The answer came the next morning, in the form of a letter. She found it in her father's Bible, tucked between worn pages. It was addressed to her, but signed by Cole Maddox. "Grace, if you're reading this, it means your father is gone. He came to me for help, not for himself, but for you. He said he wanted you to have a chance at life, away from struggle. I offered him money, but he refused. Instead, he asked me to give you work, shelter, and protection, until you found your footing. He said you'd hate me for it at first. Maybe you still will. But I made him a promise. And I intend to keep it." Her hands shook as she read the final line. Take her hand if she ever needs it, not as debt, but as destiny. Tears blurred her vision. She looked out the window where Cole stood saddling his horse, the early sun casting a gold glow on his face. He looked up, and their eyes met. No words, just understanding, and something deeper, something that had been building since the day he knocked on her door. She walked out slowly, letter still in her hand. "You could have told me," she said softly. "I didn't want you to stay out of obligation," he replied. "I wanted you to stay because you chose to." Grace took a step closer, then another. "Then I'm choosing now." For the first time, the man who had come to collect a debt didn't look like a rancher or a creditor. He looked like a man who had finally found peace. And when he reached out his hand again, she didn't hesitate. Grace's words hung in the air like a soft confession carried by the morning breeze. Cole stood still, his hand half raised, the sunlight glinting off the brim of his hat. He had faced cattle stampedes, broken men, and ruthless business deals, but nothing had ever disarmed him the way that one sentence did. "I'm choosing now." Those 4 words cracked open something in him that had been locked away for years. He looked at her, truly looked at her, the woman who had walked into his world like a sunrise he didn't know he needed. He took a step closer. "You don't know what you're choosing, Grace." She smiled faintly, her eyes bright despite the tears still glistening there. "I know enough. I'm choosing honesty. I'm choosing the man who kept a promise, even when it hurt." He wanted to tell her how many nights he'd stood by the barn window watching her work, how he admired her quiet strength, how he feared the day she might walk away. But words felt too small. Instead, he reached out and brushed his thumb over the back of her hand. The silence between them wasn't empty, it was full of all the things they didn't yet know how to say. The days that followed were softer somehow. The rhythm of the ranch carried on, horses to be fed, fences to mend, supplies to haul, but everything felt different. Cole started joining Grace in her morning chores, not because she needed help, but because he found peace in her company. They worked side by side in the golden light of dawn, sometimes in silence, sometimes trading small smiles and easy words. Grace noticed that he rarely laughed, but when he did, it was quiet, low and warm, like thunder rolling across distant hills. She began to learn his patterns. He always rose before the sun, drank his coffee black, and stood at the edge of the porch for a few minutes before the day began, as if greeting the land itself. When the work was done, he'd retreat to his study, where maps and ledgers lined the walls. He was a man of discipline, control, and solitude. Yet now, he lingered, staying at the table longer when she served dinner, walking her back to the guest house even when she insisted she could find her way. The ranch hands noticed too. One evening, as Grace carried a pail of water past the barn, old Ben, the senior hand, grinned from his post. "Careful there, Miss Grace. If you keep smilin' at the boss that way, he might forget how to count his cattle." Grace laughed, blushing. I think your boss can count just fine. Ben winked. Maybe so. But he sure can't take his eyes off you lately. She shook her head, pretending not to hear, but her heart fluttered anyway. A week later, a chill crept into the air. The autumn wind swept across the plains, carrying the scent of pine and dust. Cole had been quiet that morning, his brow furrowed as he looked over the horizon. Storm's comin', he muttered, more to himself than to her. Grace followed his gaze. How can you tell? He tipped his hat toward the clouds building in the distance. Wind shifts, sky turns heavy like that, you learn to read it after a few years out here. That afternoon, they worked quickly, securing the stables and bringing the horses in. The storm hit just before dusk, sharp rain, fierce wind, thunder cracking through the dark. Grace sat by the fire in the main house, hugging a blanket around her shoulders. Cole entered, his coat soaked, his hair damp from the rain. He looked rugged and impossibly alive, the kind of man carved out of stormlight. Everything's tied down, he said, running a hand through his hair. You all right? I am, she said softly. You shouldn't have gone out there alone. He chuckled. This isn't my first storm. I know, she whispered. But still, he looked at her then, the warmth of the fire reflecting in his eyes. You worry about me. She hesitated, then nodded. Someone should. Something shifted again, quiet, slow, undeniable. He crossed the room and sat across from her. The fire popped between them, casting shadows that danced across his face. I used to think the land was all I needed, he said after a while. That if I worked hard enough, if I built enough, I'd never feel empty again. But lately, he stopped, shaking his head. Lately, that silence doesn't feel peaceful anymore. It feels lonely. Grace's heart ached at the vulnerability in his voice. You don't have to be alone, Cole. He looked at her, searching her face. And what if I don't know how to be anything else? You learn, she said simply. Just like you taught me to ride. His lips curved into a faint smile. I didn't think you were paying attention. I was, she said. I always am. They sat there for a long time, two souls learning the language of quiet understanding. Outside, the storm raged on. Inside, it finally began to calm. The next morning, sunlight poured through the windows, the air clean and sharp after the rain. Grace stepped outside and found the ranch washed in gold, the kind of morning that felt like a promise. Cole was already out by the corral, checking the horses. She walked over, boots crunching softly against the damp earth. Everything all right? She asked. He nodded. Better than all right. The land needed that rain. Grace smiled. Seems like it wasn't the only one. He looked at her, brow furrowing slightly, but there was amusement in his eyes. You always talk in riddles. Maybe you just don't listen close enough. He chuckled, shaking his head. You've got spirit, I'll give you that. She crossed her arms, feigning offense. You sound surprised. Not surprised, he said, just grateful. The way he said it made her chest tighten. She turned away before he could see the color rise in her cheeks. As the days turned into weeks, their bond deepened in unspoken ways. Grace began to see sides of Cole that no one else did. The way he'd stop to fix a broken gate rather than call someone else. The way he'd set a sugar cube aside for her favorite horse. The way he'd pause in the middle of a sentence just to look at her, as though she'd become part of his landscape. One evening, while helping him repair a fence along the far pasture, Grace noticed the sky painted in amber and violet hues. The world felt still, suspended between day and night. Do you ever think about leaving all this behind? She asked quietly. Cole leaned against the post, considering. I used to. After my father died, I thought about selling the ranch. Moving to the city. Starting over. And why didn't you? He looked toward the setting sun. Because running never fixes what's broken. It just changes the view. Grace nodded slowly. My father used to say something similar. He said, Grace, if you can't find peace where you stand, you won't find it anywhere else. Cole smiled faintly. Smart man. She looked up at him. He trusted you. I can see why. He swallowed hard. Your father was the best man I ever knew. When he asked me to look after you, I didn't realize what that would mean. I thought it was just obligation. And now? She asked softly. He met her gaze, his eyes steady. Now it feels like the best decision I ever made. The words settled between them, fragile and honest. Grace's heart pounded, but she didn't look away. She reached out and touched his arm lightly, a gesture small but full of meaning. He didn't pull away. Winter came early that year. The first snow fell in delicate whispers, blanketing the ranch in white. Grace had never seen snow this far south before, and she stood by the porch that morning, marveling at how the land glowed in silence. Cole joined her, holding 2 mugs of steaming coffee. He handed one to her, his fingers brushing hers. "You like it? It's beautiful," she murmured. "Like the world's been wiped clean." He nodded. "That's what I like about winter. It hides the scars." She looked up at him. "Even the land heals, doesn't it?" "Eventually," he said, glancing down at her. "If you give it time." They spent that morning tending the animals, breaking ice from the troughs, and laughing when the snow came down harder. Grace slipped once, landing softly in a drift, and Cole reached down to help her up. For a moment, neither moved. Their laughter faded, replaced by a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire or the sun. He brushed a bit of snow from her hair, his touch lingering. "Grace," he began, voice rough. But she placed a hand gently on his chest. "Don't say anything," she whispered. "Just stay." And he did. Christmas came quietly on the ranch. Cole insisted on decorating the big pine near the main house. Grace helped, laughing when he tried to hang ornaments with his work gloves still on. That night, they shared dinner with the ranch hands, the house filled with warmth and laughter. Afterward, when the others had gone, Grace and Cole sat by the fire, the crackling logs the only sound between them. "I never used to celebrate," he said quietly. "Too many memories. Maybe it's time to make new ones," she replied. He looked at her, his expression softening. "You really believe people can start over?" "I think sometimes they just need someone to remind them it's possible." He didn't answer right away. Then he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small box. "I didn't plan on this," he said, a hint of nervousness in his voice. "But I saw it in town last week, and it made me think of you." Grace opened the box and gasped. Inside was a simple silver necklace, shaped like a lark in flight. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "Your father once told me you loved birds," he said softly. "Said they made you believe in freedom." She blinked back tears. "You remembered that." "I remember everything you say, Grace." He stood, walked behind her, and clasped the necklace around her neck. When she turned, his hands were still there, resting lightly on her shoulders. "You've brought something back here," he murmured. "Something I thought I lost a long time ago." "What's that?" "Hope." Her throat tightened. Then maybe it was never gone. Maybe it was just waiting. He smiled, and in that moment, all the walls he'd built came crumbling down. Spring arrived slowly, tenderly, painting the land in green again. Flowers pushed through the thawing soil, and the horses grazed under blue skies. Grace had been at Maddox Ranch for nearly a year now. The debt her father left behind had long been paid, but neither she nor Cole had mentioned it. The subject seemed small now compared to what they had built between them. One evening, she stood at the edge of the pasture, watching the sun dip below the hills. Cole joined her, his presence grounding and familiar. "You know," she said quietly, "I could leave now. The debt's cleared. You've done more for me than I can ever repay." He nodded slowly. "You could." She turned to face him. "Do you want me to?" He looked at her for a long time, then shook his head. "No. But I don't ever want you to feel trapped here. If you stay, it has to be because it's what you want." Grace smiled through the ache in her chest. "It is." He took her hands in his, rough and warm. "Then stay. Not because of your father. Not because of a promise. Stay because you and I have both spent too many years chasing ghosts. Maybe it's time we built something real." Tears welled in her eyes, but this time, they weren't from pain. "I think we already have." And when he leaned in, slow and certain, she met him halfway. It wasn't a desperate kiss, it was quiet, steady, full of everything they hadn't needed to say aloud. The wind moved softly through the grass, carrying with it the scent of rain and renewal. Years later, the townsfolk still told stories about the rancher and the girl who changed his heart. They said the land had never looked greener, the cattle never stronger. But those who visited Maddox Ranch knew the truth. It wasn't the land that had healed, it was the people. Grace still walked the pastures at sunrise, the lark-shaped pendant glinting against her skin. Cole still rose early, coffee in hand, but now he waited on the porch for her to join him. Some mornings, they spoke of her father,